They tried to erase her name from the records. Every trace of Delilah Rousseau was methodically scrubbed from the plantation ledgers, the city directories, the church registries. Her recipes were burned. Her quarters were torn down within days. Even the iron kettle she used daily for 23 years was melted down and recast into horseshoes. But you cannot destroy a truth that has already taken root in human memory. And the truth about what happened in that Garden District mansion on November 17, 1852, has been growing in the shadows for over a century, fed by whispered stories and half-remembered nightmares. You are about to learn why the Thibodeau family fortune vanished overnight. Why their grand estate at 1847 Royal Street was abandoned so suddenly that dinner plates were left on the table, crystal glasses still holding wine. Why 3 generations of New Orleans high society developed an inexplicable aversion to Creole cuisine that persisted well into the 20th century. The official records will tell you it was yellow fever. The newspapers blamed financial ruin. But the servants who survived, the ones who fled that house before dawn on November 18th, they knew better. They carried stories that were never meant to be told. What the authorities discovered in the weeks following that night defied every attempt at rational explanation. The dining room had been sealed from the inside, with no apparent means of entry or exit, yet 36 place settings remained perfectly arranged around a table that showed no signs of disturbance. The food on the plates had not spoiled, despite the Louisiana heat and humidity. In fact, it appeared to be still warm, still fresh, as if the meal had been served only moments before. Steam continued to rise from the serving dishes for 3 weeks after the house was abandoned, visible to anyone who peered through the gaps in the hastily erected barriers. The kitchen told a different story entirely. Every pot and pan had been scrubbed to an impossible shine, arranged with military precision on shelves that bore no trace of dust or grease, despite decades of constant use. The pantry was completely empty, stripped of every grain of rice, every bottle of spice, every preserved ingredient that Delilah had collected over her years of service. But the strangest discovery was the garden behind the kitchen, where plants that shouldn't have been able to grow in Louisiana soil continued to flourish in patterns that seemed to shift when observed directly. Dr. Armand Thureau, the parish coroner, was called to examine the scene 3 days after the servants fled. His official report, archived in the basement of the New Orleans Public Library, makes for disturbing reading even today. He found no bodies, no blood, no signs of violence or struggle, but he did find evidence of what he could only describe as, quote, biological anomalies throughout the house. Scales embedded in the dining room carpet, gill slits carved into the wooden chairbacks, handprints pressed into the plaster walls that showed fingerprints belonging to no known human configuration. Most disturbing of all were the mirrors. Every reflective surface in the house had been altered somehow, their silvered backs bearing impressions that seemed to move independently of any viewer. Dr. Thureau reported seeing faces in these mirrors, faces that belonged to the missing dinner guests but showed features that were no longer entirely human. He watched Judge Beauregard's reflection attempting to speak, mouth opening and closing in silent desperation. He observed Mrs. Fontaine's image trying to reach through the glass, her webbed fingers pressing against the surface from inside, a reflection that had no corresponding reality. The doctor's report was classified immediately upon submission. Dr. Thureau himself was found dead in his study 2 weeks later, apparently having consumed a meal of turtle soup that no one remembered preparing for him. His assistant, young Dr. Mercier's nephew Claude, discovered the body and noted that his uncle's eyes had become fixed and unblinking, staring at a journal filled with notes written in a language that resembled no known script but somehow conveyed meaning to anyone who looked at it long enough. Delilah Rousseau came to New Orleans in 1829, purchased at the age of 16 from a sugar plantation in Saint-Domingue that had been owned by the same family for 4 generations. The bill of sale, one of the few documents that escaped the subsequent purge, describes her as, quote, mulatto, sound of limb, experienced in culinary arts, literate in French and English, trained in household management and herb cultivation. What the document doesn't mention is what she learned during her childhood on that Caribbean island, where the boundary between cuisine and conjure had never been clearly drawn, where recipes passed down through generations carried more than flavor, where certain meals were prepared not just to nourish the body, but to alter the fundamental nature of those who consumed them. The plantation where Delilah was born belonged to the Leclerc family, French colonists who had arrived in Saint-Domingue in 1697 with ambitious plans for sugar cultivation and limited understanding of the forces they were unleashing. The African slaves they imported brought with them knowledge that had been preserved across ocean crossings and auction blocks, traditions that adapted to new ingredients and new circumstances while maintaining their essential power. Delilah's grandmother, a woman known only as Maman Brigitte, had been the plantation's head cook for 30 years before passing her knowledge to her daughter, who passed it in turn to Delilah. This knowledge went far beyond the conventional understanding of cooking. It encompassed the spiritual properties of ingredients, the ritual significance of preparation methods, the symbolic power of combining certain foods in specific proportions. Maman Brigitte taught her descendants that every meal was an opportunity to influence the world, that food could carry intentions as well as flavors, that a skilled cook could weave fate itself into her recipes for those wise enough to understand the deeper principles involved. The lessons began when Delilah was old enough to hold a knife safely. She learned which herbs should be harvested during the new moon and which required the full moon's light to reach their peak potency. She memorized the properties of roots that could enhance memory or cloud judgment, spices that could inspire love or provoke hatred, combinations that could heal the body or transform it into something entirely different. Most importantly, she learned that intention was the most crucial ingredient in any recipe, that the cook's purpose and will determined whether a meal would nourish or poison, heal or harm, sustain or transform. The Saint-Domingue Revolution of 1791 shattered the world Delilah had known. The Leclerc plantation was burned to the ground, its owners fleeing to New Orleans with whatever possessions they could carry. Delilah, then 8 years old, was among the human cargo they transported, sold quickly to pay for their passage and resettlement. She spent 8 years in the household of a Spanish merchant named Valdez, learning Creole cooking traditions that she carefully integrated with the knowledge her grandmother had passed down to her. But it was her sale to the Thibodeau family in 1829 that would determine the course of her destiny and theirs. Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau was building his reputation as one of New Orleans' most prominent sugar merchants, importing raw materials from Caribbean plantations and refining them in his facilities along the Mississippi River. His wife Marie Claire dreamed of hosting elaborate dinner parties that would cement their position in Creole society, events that would establish them as cultural leaders worthy of respect and admiration from the established families who had looked down on their nouveau riche status. The Thibodeau family thought they had acquired a valuable asset in Delilah. Her reputation as a cook had preceded her sale, with former employers speaking of her gumbo with religious reverence, describing her pralines as works of art, claiming her coffee could wake the dead, and her jambalaya could make angels weep with joy. What they didn't mention, what perhaps they never noticed or chose to ignore, was the way other servants would cross themselves when they passed her kitchen, the way cats would refuse to enter her domain, the way certain herbs in her garden grew in patterns that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. For 23 years, Delilah ruled the Thibodeau kitchen with an iron hand and an uncompromising will. She established routines and traditions that became the foundation of the household's daily life. Breakfast was served at precisely 7 o'clock each morning, featuring fresh bread that she baked before dawn and coffee prepared from beans that she roasted herself, according to specifications that she never shared with anyone else. Lunch was a lighter affair, usually featuring soup made from ingredients that varied with the seasons and her assessment of the family's needs and moods. But it was dinner that showcased her true artistry. Every evening at 6 o'clock, she would present a meal that transformed the Thibodeau dining room into a stage for culinary theater. Each course was planned with meticulous attention to flavor, presentation, and what she privately thought of as deeper purposes. She trained a staff of 6 undercooks who learned to follow her instructions without question, who understood that some recipes were not to be shared beyond the kitchen walls, some ingredients were not to be handled by unauthorized hands, and certain preparations required solitude and concentration that brooked no interruption. The dinner party she orchestrated became legendary throughout New Orleans society. Politicians would time their visits to coincide with her meals, arriving with transparent excuses about business discussions that could only be conducted over proper food. Plantation owners would travel from as far as Baton Rouge for the chance to taste her famous turtle soup, a dish that combined traditional Creole techniques with secret ingredients that she sourced through networks of suppliers who never asked questions about her unusual requests. Society wives would attempt to steal her servants, offering double and triple wages for even the smallest insight into her methods and recipes. But what the guests never understood was that Delilah was studying them as carefully as they were enjoying her food. Every dinner party was an opportunity for her to observe the casual cruelties and unconscious assumptions that characterized their daily lives. She listened to their conversations about buying and selling human beings as if discussing livestock. She watched them plan the separation of families with the same detached interest they might show in selecting wines for their cellars. She served them courses that grew more elaborate with each party, while they discussed methods for maximizing the productivity of their human property through techniques that would have made medieval torturers proud. The other servants in the Thibodeau household learned to recognize the signs when Delilah was particularly displeased with something she had witnessed or overheard. The kitchen would grow unnaturally quiet during these periods, filled with an atmosphere of barely controlled tension that made everyone speak in whispers and move with exaggerated care. The food she prepared during these times was somehow more intense than usual, flavors that seemed to penetrate deeper than normal taste sensations. Meals that left diners feeling strangely energized or oddly melancholic depending on her assessment of their character and behavior. Marie-Claire Thibodeau prided herself on being a progressive mistress who treated her slaves with kindness and consideration. She allowed them to attend church services, provided them with adequate clothing and housing, and even permitted them to earn small amounts of money by taking on additional work during their free time. What she failed to understand was that these gestures, while better than the brutal treatment common on many plantations, still operated within a framework that treated human beings as property to be managed, rather than people to be respected. Delilah observed these contradictions with the patient attention of a scholar studying an interesting but disturbing phenomenon. She watched Marie-Claire agonize over the decision to sell a young housemaid whose pregnancy would interfere with her duties, weighing the financial considerations against her genuine concern for the girl's welfare. She listened to tearful conversations where Marie-Claire expressed sorrow about the necessity of breaking up slave families while simultaneously calculating the profits from such separations. Most painfully, she endured countless occasions when Marie-Claire would praise her cooking and express genuine affection for her, while discussing her potential sale as casually as she might consider redecorating the parlor. The younger generation of the Thibodeau family showed even less awareness of these contradictions. Henri Thibodeau had returned from Paris in 1851 with expensive tastes, mounting debts, and a worldview that had been shaped by European intellectuals who theorized about slavery from the comfortable distance of academic salons. He spoke eloquently about the burdens of civilizing inferior races while systematically squandering the wealth that their labor had created. His sister Marguerite had married into the prominent Beauregard family, bringing with her dowry that included 3 household slaves and a detailed inventory of their reproductive potential calculated over the next 20 years. These were the people who had owned Delilah's life for 23 years, who had consumed her labor and her talent while remaining utterly blind to her humanity. They praised her cooking while planning her sale. They depended on her expertise while treating her as a valuable but ultimately replaceable tool. They benefited from her knowledge while ensuring that she could never profit from it herself or pass it on to anyone she chose. And most insulting of all, they genuinely believed that they were benevolent masters who deserved gratitude for their restraint in not treating her worse. The trouble began in October 1852, when Jean-Baptiste Thibaudot made a decision that would cost him everything he held dear. His son Henri's debts had reached critical proportions, threatening the family's social standing and financial stability. The sugar business was struggling under pressure from Cuban competition and changing international trade relationships. The mansion on Royal Street required constant maintenance that was becoming increasingly expensive. Marie Claire's social obligations demanded ever more elaborate entertainment that strained their resources. Something had to be done to generate immediate cash while reducing ongoing expenses. Henri suggested a solution that seemed both practical and profitable: liquidate their most valuable human assets, starting with those who commanded the highest prices at auction. Delilah topped that list. At 39, she was still young enough to provide years of service to a new owner, but experienced enough to command a premium price. Her reputation as a cook made her especially valuable to plantation owners or urban families who wanted to establish their culinary credentials quickly. The Marchand family had already made inquiries about purchasing her, offering a sum that would solve Henri's immediate financial problems while eliminating the largest single expense in their household budget. The announcement was made on October 23rd, a Thursday morning when the autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and distant cooking fires. Jean-Baptiste called Delilah into his study, the same room where 23 years earlier he had signed the papers making her his property. The study was a monument to his success, lined with leather-bound books he had never read, and furnished with mahogany pieces that had been crafted by slaves whose names he had never bothered to learn. Oil paintings of his ancestors looked down from the walls, stern-faced men and women who had built their fortunes on the systematic exploitation of human misery, while convincing themselves they were pillars of Christian civilization. He explained the situation with the casual indifference of a man discussing the sale of livestock. The family's financial circumstances required certain sacrifices. Delilah would be sold to the Marchand plantation upriver, along with 2 of her assistant cooks whose contracts could be transferred as part of the same transaction. The new owners had specifically requested her, offering a price that Jean-Baptiste could not refuse in good conscience. She would have 1 month to train her replacement and prepare for the transfer. He was sure she would understand the necessity of the arrangement and would cooperate to ensure a smooth transition. Delilah listened in complete silence. Those who were present later reported that she showed no emotion during the conversation, asked no questions about her new circumstances, made no pleas for reconsideration or appeals to their long relationship. She simply stood, with her hands folded, her expression neutral, her posture erect and dignified. When Jean-Baptiste finished his explanation, she nodded once, said, "Yes, sir," in a voice that carried no trace of distress or resentment, turned, and walked back to her kitchen to begin preparations for the evening meal. But the other servants noticed changes immediately, subtle alterations in her routine that suggested a fundamental shift in her approach to her work and her relationship with the family. She began to hum while she worked, old songs in a language none of them recognized, melodies that seemed to carry meanings that went beyond their musical content. The tunes were hauntingly beautiful but somehow disturbing, creating atmospheres of unease that persisted long after the music stopped. When asked about the songs, she would only smile and say they were lullabies her grandmother had taught her, traditional melodies that helped her concentrate on her cooking. She also began requesting unusual ingredients, items that had to be special ordered from ships arriving from the Caribbean and Central America. Exotic spices with names that the suppliers couldn't pronounce, roots and herbs that required careful handling and storage in conditions she specified with scientific precision. The orders were expensive, but the Thibaudot family approved them without question, assuming they were for some elaborate farewell dinner that would showcase her talents one final time before her departure. Most significantly, she started working alone in the evenings, sending the other cooks home early and locking the kitchen doors behind them. The staff could see lights flickering in the kitchen windows long after the dinner service was complete, could smell complex aromas drifting from the building that combined familiar scents with others that defied identification. When they arrived for work the next morning, they would find the kitchen immaculate, every surface scrubbed clean, every utensil in its proper place, with no evidence of whatever work had occupied her through the night. November 17, 1852, was chosen as the date for her farewell celebration. Marie Claire announced it as a grand dinner party, an opportunity for New Orleans society to bid goodbye to the greatest cook the city had ever known. It would be a tribute to her years of service and a demonstration of the family's gratitude for her contributions to their household. Invitations were sent to 36 of the most prominent families in the city, each one handwritten on cream-colored paper with the Thibodeau family crest embossed in gold leaf. The guest list read like a directory of Louisiana's social and political elite, including judges, plantation owners, merchants, politicians, and society matrons who had been competing for such invitations for decades. The menu was planned with meticulous care, featuring all of Delilah's signature dishes prepared with ingredients that represented the pinnacle of her culinary artistry. She would begin with her famous turtle soup, a dish that had become her trademark throughout New Orleans, prepared from snappers caught in Lake Pontchartrain and seasoned with spices that she had been perfecting for over 20 years. The second course would feature pompano en papillote, fish wrapped in parchment with herbs from her private garden and baked according to techniques that she had never shared with anyone else. The centerpiece would be her legendary jambalaya, a dish that combined rice, seafood, and spices in proportions that other cooks had tried unsuccessfully to replicate, achieving flavors that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of earthly cuisine. For 3 days before the dinner party, Delilah worked with an intensity and focus that alarmed the other servants. She barely slept, rarely left the kitchen, except to visit her garden for ingredients that she selected with the care of a jeweler choosing precious stones. The basement prep areas became off-limits to everyone else, with sounds of grinding and mixing emanating from below that continued through the night. Strange smells began to permeate the entire house, sweet and acrid scents that seemed to change depending on who was breathing them and when they encountered them. The other cooks reported seeing her working by candlelight in the hours before dawn, stirring enormous pots with wooden spoons that she had carved herself from driftwood collected along the Mississippi River. She would mutter while she worked, speaking in languages that shifted between French and Spanish and something else entirely, words that seemed to have physical weight and substance despite their incomprehensibility. When the younger servants approached to offer assistance, she would wave them away with gestures that brooked no argument, her attention completely absorbed by preparations that required absolute solitude and concentration. The garden behind the kitchen began to exhibit peculiar characteristics during this period. Plants that had been growing normally for months suddenly accelerated their development, reaching maturity and fruiting out of season. Herbs that typically required specific soil conditions and climate parameters began thriving in arrangements that defied botanical logic. Most disturbing, the garden seemed to rearrange itself between visits, with pathways that led to different destinations depending on when they were traveled and who was walking them. The other servants learned to avoid the garden entirely during these final days, sensing energies that their rational minds couldn't explain, but their instincts recognized as dangerous. On November 16th, the day before the dinner party, Delilah sent all the other kitchen staff home early and spent the entire night in final preparations. The house staff reported seeing lights in the kitchen windows that flickered in colors that shouldn't have been possible, with candles or oil lamps. The aromas that drifted from the building during these final hours defied description, combining the sense of cooking food with undertones that suggested incense, perfume, and something else that seemed organic but unidentifiable. Several servants reported dreams that night of being invited to feast at tables that stretched beyond the horizon, where food was served by hosts whose faces could never be clearly seen. The guests began arriving at 7 o'clock on a November evening that felt unseasonably warm, as if the house itself was generating heat from some internal source. The weather had been cool and crisp earlier in the day, typical for late autumn in New Orleans, but the temperature rose steadily as the sun set, creating an atmosphere that felt more like midsummer than the approach of winter. Carriages deposited their elegantly dressed passengers at the front entrance, where they were greeted by Marie Claire wearing a gown that had been imported from Paris, specifically for the occasion. The dining room had been decorated with autumn flowers and French crystal, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance that showcased the family's wealth and taste. Candles cast dancing shadows on the burgundy wallpaper, their flames unusually steady despite the warm air that should have created currents and drafts. The massive mahogany table had been set with the family's finest china, silver that had been polished to mirror brightness, and crystal glasses that seemed to ring with musical tones when touched by the slightest vibration. 36 of New Orleans. Elite took their seats around the table, their conversations filled with anticipation for Delilah's legendary cuisine and speculation about her future with the Martian family. Judge Beauregard held court at one end of the table, regaling his listeners with stories of recent court cases and his plans for expanding his own plantation holdings. Mrs. Fontaine discussed her latest charitable endeavors, which focused on improving conditions for slaves through education and moral instruction that would make them more productive and content with their circumstances. Dr. Mercier described his recent research into the physiological differences between races, studies that he believed would provide scientific justification for the social arrangements that benefited everyone involved. The conversations were typical of such gatherings, combining social pleasantries with business discussions and political commentary that revealed the fundamental assumptions underlying their worldview. These were people who had never questioned their right to own other human beings, who had built their fortunes on systematic exploitation while convincing themselves they were benefactors of civilization. They spoke casually of buying and selling people as if discussing livestock, planned the separation of families with the same detached interest they might show in selecting wines for their cellars, and discussed methods for maximizing human productivity through techniques that would have horrified them if applied to their own children. The first course arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, carried by silent servants who moved with unusual precision and coordination. Delilah's famous turtle soup was served in delicate porcelain bowls that had been in the Thibodeau family for 3 generations, each one heated to the perfect temperature and garnished with herbs that released their aromas only when the soup reached the diner's lips. The presentation was flawless, the timing precise, the service executed with a professionalism that reflected decades of experience and training. The guests praised the soup's richness and complexity, noting flavors that seemed to evolve and develop with each spoonful. Several commented that it tasted different from usual, more intense somehow, as if the essence of the turtle had been concentrated into liquid form through some alchemical process that transcended ordinary cooking techniques. They laughed and joked about feeling more alive after eating it, about sensing their heartbeats quickening with excitement and anticipation for the courses that would follow. What they didn't notice, what they couldn't have known to look for, was the way the soup seemed to glow with an inner light that became visible only when observed from certain angles. The way the steam rising from each bowl formed shapes in the air that resembled hieroglyphs from languages that had been old when Egypt was young. The way the liquid itself seemed to move with purpose, swirling in patterns that defied the normal laws of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics. The second course was pompano en papillote, fish wrapped in parchment and baked with herbs that Delilah had grown herself in soil that she had prepared according to specifications passed down through her family for generations. When the packets were opened at the table, the aroma that escaped was intoxicating, a blend of seafood and spices that seemed to bypass the nose and go directly to the brain, triggering responses that operated below the level of conscious awareness. The guests found themselves eating with unusual enthusiasm, abandoning their typical social restraint to devour every morsel on their plates. They spoke of feeling a strange energy coursing through their bodies, a vitality they hadn't experienced since their youth. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more musical, the very air more sweet to breathe. They attributed these sensations to the excellence of the food and the pleasure of fine company, not realizing that they were experiencing the first stages of a transformation that had been years in the planning. The fish had been prepared with more than herbs and spices. Delilah had incorporated elements that her grandmother had taught her to recognize and harvest, substances that existed at the boundary between the botanical and the spiritual. She had aged them in containers that had been blessed according to traditions that predated European colonization, had ground them with mortars and pestles that had been carved from wood that grew only in specific locations, under particular conditions of moonlight and rainfall. But it was the third course that would seal their fate forever. Delilah's jambalaya was legendary throughout New Orleans, a dish that combined rice, seafood, and spices in proportions that other cooks had tried unsuccessfully to replicate for decades. Professional chefs had offered enormous sums for her recipe, had attempted to bribe her assistants for even partial information about her methods, had tried to recreate the dish through careful observation and chemical analysis. All had failed to produce anything that approached the complexity and perfection of her original creation. On this night, however, she had prepared something different. Something special, something that represented the culmination of 23 years of patient planning and careful preparation. The rice seemed to glow with an inner light, each grain perfectly separate yet bound to its neighbors in harmonious unity that defied ordinary understanding of how such ingredients should behave. The seafood was tender beyond description, dissolving on the tongue like sea foam, while somehow maintaining distinct flavors that told the stories of the waters where it had lived and died. The spices created a symphony of sensation that built in complexity with each bite, revealing new notes and harmonies that seemed impossible for any earthly cuisine to contain. The guests ate in near silence, their usual dinner conversation replaced by soft moans of pleasure and wonder. Several confided to their neighbors that they had never tasted anything so extraordinary, that the food seemed to be nourishing not just their bodies, but their very souls. They felt young again, alive in ways they had forgotten were possible, connected to energies and sensations that their normal lives had somehow excluded or suppressed. The jambalaya had been prepared with ingredients that transcended the merely physical. Rice that had been grown in soil, fertilized with the ashes of those who had died in chains, each grain carrying the memory of their suffering and their dreams of freedom. Seafood that had been caught in waters where slave ships had dumped their human cargo. Creatures that had fed on the bones of those who hadn't survived the Middle Passage. Spices that had been traded along routes established by human trafficking. Each aromatic molecule carrying the echo of transactions where people were bought and sold like commodities. But the most powerful ingredient had been time itself. 23 years of forced servitude, 23 years of watching these people feast on her labor while treating her as property, 23 years of swallowed rage and suppressed dignity had fermented into something potent beyond imagination. She had been saving it all, storing every slight and humiliation like wine in a cellar, waiting for the perfect moment to uncork the vintage and serve it to those who had created it through their casual cruelty and unconscious assumptions. The transformation began slowly at first, manifesting as subtle changes that the guests attributed to the effects of excellent food and fine wine. Judge Beauregard noticed that his reflection in the silver serving platters looked somehow different. His features subtly altered, as if he was seeing himself through different eyes, or from an unexpected angle. Mrs. Fontaine felt her skin beginning to itch, a sensation that started as minor irritation, but grew more intense by the minute, as if something was moving beneath the surface of her flesh. Dr. Mercier discovered that his thoughts were no longer entirely his own, memories surfacing that belonged to other people, other times, other lives entirely. It was Marie-Claire Thibodeau who first realized that something was fundamentally wrong. She had been watching Delilah through the serving window, observing the cook's satisfied smile as she watched the guests consume her final masterpiece. But as the minutes passed, Marie-Claire began to feel strange sensations in her own body that went far beyond the normal effects of food and alcohol. Her heartbeat had accelerated to an alarming degree, pounding in her chest with a rhythm that seemed to match some unheard music. Her vision was becoming sharper, almost painfully acute, as if she could see individual dust motes floating in the candlelight and trace their paths through the air with perfect clarity. Her hearing had grown so sensitive that she could perceive conversations from the servants. Quarters 2 floors below, could distinguish between the breathing patterns of different guests around the table, could hear the sound of her own blood moving through her veins like a river in flood. These weren't normal responses to even the most exceptional meal, and the realization filled her with a dread that seemed to come from some primitive part of her mind that understood danger in ways her civilized consciousness couldn't process. She looked around the table and realized that all the guests were experiencing similar changes, their bodies responding to influences that had nothing to do with ordinary digestion or nutrition. Judge Beauregard's eyes had taken on an unnatural brightness. Pupils dilated to black pools that seemed to reflect light like mirrors, and showed depths that couldn't exist in normal human anatomy. Mrs. Fontaine was gripping her wine glass so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, her breathing rapid and shallow, as if she was drowning in air that had become too thick to process through human lungs. Dr. Mercier was staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, flexing his fingers with fascination and growing alarm as he watched them change shape and texture in ways that violated everything he understood about human physiology. The other guests showed similar signs of transformation, their faces reflecting confusion and terror as they realized that something unprecedented was happening to their bodies and minds. "What did you put in the food?" Marie-Claire called out to the kitchen, her voice carrying a tremor that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the growing awareness that she was experiencing something that couldn't be explained by any rational framework she possessed. Delilah appeared in the doorway, still wearing her pristine white apron, her dark eyes reflecting the candlelight with an intensity that made several guests look away in instinctive fear. She was no longer the subservient cook they had known for 23 years, no longer the property they had planned to sell for profit. Something fundamental had changed in her posture, her expression, her very presence in the room. She stood like a queen surveying her domain, like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict that had been 23 years in the making, like a priestess conducting a ritual that would reshape reality according to laws that predated human civilization. "I put my heart into it," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence that had fallen over the dining room like a shroud. "My soul, my blood, my memory of every insult, every casual cruelty, every moment when you forgot I was human, every time you discussed my sale as if I was livestock, every time you planned my future without consulting my wishes, every time you benefited from my labor while denying my humanity." The transformation accelerated as her words reached their ears, as if her voice itself carried power that catalyzed the changes that had been building in their bodies since the first course. Judge Beauregard was the first to fully manifest, his skin beginning to shift and ripple as it took on the scaled texture of the turtle whose life had flavored their soup. His eyes elongated and became fixed, unable to blink, staring with the cold intelligence of a reptile that had never known warmth or mammalian emotion. His movements became slow and deliberate, as if he was adapting to life underwater, his limbs restructuring themselves for an existence in depths where sunlight never penetrated. When he tried to speak, only bubbling sounds emerged from his throat, the voice of something that belonged in the muddy bottom of bayou pools, rather than in the refined atmosphere of dining rooms. His desperate attempts to communicate became increasingly frantic as he realized that his human capacity for language was disappearing along with his human form, leaving him trapped in a body that could never again express the thoughts and feelings that had defined his identity for 63 years. Mrs. Fontaine's transformation was more subtle but equally horrifying. The fish she had consumed with such pleasure began to remake her from within, restructuring her respiratory system to process oxygen from water rather than air. Her breathing became labored as gills opened along her neck, delicate pink membranes that fluttered with each breath but couldn't extract enough oxygen from the atmosphere to sustain her hybrid physiology. Her fingers webbed themselves together while she watched in fascination and terror, her bones hollowing and reshaping themselves for a life in depths she had never imagined visiting. Her skin took on a silvery sheen that reflected light in patterns that hurt to look at directly, scales forming in geometric arrangements that followed mathematical principles that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. She tried to remove her jewelry, but found that her wedding ring had fused with her flesh, becoming part of a transformation that was rewriting her identity at the cellular level and beyond. Dr. Mercier found his consciousness expanding in ways that no medical training could have prepared him for. The spices in the jambalaya had opened doorways in his mind that were meant to remain closed, pathways that connected his individual awareness to vast networks of memory and experience that spanned centuries and continents. He began to experience the memories of everyone who had ever consumed rice grown in Louisiana soil, their lives and deaths flooding through his awareness in an overwhelming cascade that threatened to drown his individual identity in an ocean of collective experience. He saw slaves working in fields under the merciless sun, their children sold away from them, their bodies broken by labor that enriched the very people now sitting around this table. He felt their pain as if it were his own, and understood with crystal clarity that it was his own, had always been his own, would always be his own. The economic system that had supported his comfortable life was built on suffering that he was now experiencing directly, without the protective barriers of distance and rationalization that had allowed him to ignore it for 68 years. The other guests underwent their own unique transformations, each one crafted by Delilah's precise understanding of their individual cruelties and weaknesses, their specific roles in perpetuating the system that had stolen her life and sold it for profit. Judge Beauregard, who had sent so many people to their deaths with casual indifference, found his body becoming translucent, his substance draining away until he was little more than a ghost haunting his own chair, unable to affect the physical world but forced to observe it with perfect clarity and complete helplessness. Mrs. Marchand, who had made a fortune trading in human misery, discovered that her hands were dissolving into the very coins she had counted so obsessively, her fingers becoming gold and silver that burned her flesh, even as they replaced it. The pain was exquisite and endless, each transformed digit maintaining full sensation while becoming increasingly unable to perform the basic functions that had defined her existence. She could no longer hold objects, could no longer touch another person, could no longer even feel the texture of fabric or food. Her identity as someone who controlled and manipulated the physical world through wealth was being systematically stripped away, leaving her trapped in a body that could generate money but could never again spend it or enjoy the pleasures it might purchase. Senator Boudreaux, who had crafted legislation that tightened the bonds of slavery while speaking eloquently about states' rights and constitutional principles, found his tongue splitting and forking like a serpent's, his words becoming hisses that conveyed meaning but inspired only revulsion in those who heard them. His carefully practiced oratory, the tool he had used to justify unconscionable policies through elegant rhetoric, was being transformed into something that revealed the venomous nature of his thoughts without the protective camouflage of civilized language. Colonel Trem, whose military career had been built on tracking down runaway slaves and returning them to their owners, discovered that his legs were fusing together, his mobility becoming dependent on slithering movements that left trails of slime across the polished floors. His proud bearing, the ramrod posture that had intimidated slaves and impressed fellow officers, was being reduced to the graceless locomotion of creatures that lived in mud and darkness. Each transformation was a masterpiece of symbolic justice, punishment that fit the crime with mathematical precision, while ensuring that the guilty would understand exactly why they were suffering and what their suffering represented. Delilah had studied these people for years, had listened to their conversations, and observed their behavior with the careful attention of a scientist documenting specimens. She knew their weaknesses, their fears, their secret shames, and she had crafted punishments that would force them to confront the reality of what they had become through their choices and actions. Through it all, Delilah watched with the satisfied expression of an artist viewing a completed masterpiece, a creator whose vision had finally been realized after decades of patient planning and careful preparation. This was her final menu, her ultimate recipe, the dish she had been preparing for 23 years without fully realizing it. Each ingredient had been chosen not just for flavor but for symbolic power, each technique refined not just for texture but for spiritual efficacy, each guest selected not just for social position but for their specific role in perpetuating the system that had stolen her life and sold it for profit. But transformation is never a simple process, and the laws that govern such changes are older and more complex than human understanding can encompass. As the guests completed their metamorphosis, as their human forms gave way to the creatures they had always been inside, the house itself began to respond to the ritual that had been performed within its walls. The floorboards started to warp and bulge, as if something vast was moving beneath them, something that had been sleeping in the foundation since the house was built, and was now stirring in response to energies that had finally reached sufficient intensity to wake it. The wallpaper began to peel away in strips that fell upward instead of down, revealing surfaces underneath that bore hieroglyphs and languages that predated European colonization. The very air grew thick and syrupy, difficult to breathe, charged with energies that made the candle flames dance in impossible colors that hurt to look at directly. The crystal glasses began to ring with musical tones that formed harmonies no human composer had ever conceived, melodies that seemed to originate from the transformed guests themselves as their new forms adapted to vibrational frequencies that existed outside normal human perception. The house was revealing its true nature, the spiritual architecture that had always existed beneath its physical appearance. Every brick in its walls represented a life cut short by the system it housed. Every board in its floors was a dream destroyed by the institution it supported. Every pane of glass in its windows was a family torn apart and sold to different masters. The mansion had been built with more than stone and timber and mortar. It had been constructed from human suffering, cemented with tears and blood, designed to contain and display the wealth that such suffering generated. Marie Claire Thibodeau, perhaps because she had eaten less than the others, or perhaps because some vestige of human decency still protected her, retained enough of her original form to attempt escape. She stumbled from her chair, her legs already beginning to change but still functional enough to carry her toward the dining room door. But Delilah was waiting for her there, no longer the elderly cook who had served the family faithfully for decades, but something else entirely, something that existed at the intersection of justice and vengeance, of human will and cosmic force. The woman blocking Marie Claire's path was ageless, terrible in her beauty and her wrath, surrounded by an aura of power that made the very air shimmer like heat waves above summer pavement. Her eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire universes, spaces where justice was calculated according to laws that operated outside human understanding, but with perfect mathematical precision. Her hands, still steady and sure from decades of cooking, now glowed with energies that could reshape reality according to her will and intention. "Where are you going?" Delilah asked, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies human ears weren't designed to perceive, sounds that bypassed the auditory system entirely and spoke directly to the soul. "The meal isn't finished yet. We still have dessert." The dessert was already prepared, had been waiting in the kitchen since before the guests arrived. It was a simple bread pudding, the kind of humble dish that slaves had created from table scraps and leftover ingredients, transforming refuse into sustenance through ingenuity and skill that their masters never bothered to acknowledge or appreciate. But Delilah had prepared this one with ingredients that transcended the physical realm, components that existed at the boundary between matter and spirit, between the world of the living and the realm of those who had died without justice. She had used bread soaked in the tears of mothers whose children had been sold away from them, each drop carrying the weight of love that had been violated and bonds that had been severed for profit. She had sweetened it with the final breath of men who died in chains, their last exhalation distilled into essence that contained all their unfulfilled dreams and unrealized potential. She had flavored it with the ground bones of those who had been worked to death in the very fields that made their masters rich, their calcium providing structure for a dessert that would ensure their sacrifices were never forgotten. This dessert was not meant to transform like the previous courses. It was meant to preserve, to lock the guests in their new forms permanently, to ensure that their metamorphosis could never be reversed by time or medicine or prayer. It would make them eternal monuments to their own cruelty, living reminders of the price that evil eventually pays when the bill comes due and the accounts are finally balanced. Marie Claire understood this instinctively, the way prey animals understand the intentions of predators through senses that operate below the level of conscious thought. She tried to push past Delilah, but found her path blocked by something more substantial than a human body. The cook had become a force of nature, as immovable as a mountain, as inevitable as a hurricane, as inescapable as the consequences of choices that could never be undone or forgiven. Marie Claire's pleas for mercy fell on ears that had listened to too many pleas go unanswered, that had heard too many promises broken, too many lies told to justify the unjustifiable. Her appeals to their long relationship were met with reminders of how that relationship had been structured, with her as owner and Delilah as property, with power flowing in only one direction despite decades of dependence and interaction. "Please," Marie-Claire whispered, her voice already changing as her throat restructured itself around vocal cords that were no longer entirely human. "We never meant to hurt you. We cared for you. We gave you a home, food, protection. We treated you well." Delilah's laugh was like wind chimes made of bone, beautiful and terrible, and utterly without warmth or forgiveness. It was the sound of justice finally arriving after centuries of delay, the voice of retribution that had been accumulating interest for generations of unpaid debts. "You gave me nothing that was yours to give. This house was built with stolen labor. This food was grown by stolen hands. Even the plates you eat from were purchased with stolen lives. You never owned me, Marie-Claire. You just convinced yourselves that you did, the same way you convinced yourselves that cruelty was kindness, that slavery was natural, that human beings could be property." She gestured toward the dining room, where the transformed guests writhed and adapted to their new existence, their human consciousness trapped in forms that could never again participate in the civilized society they had once dominated. "Look at them now. Look at what they've become. This is who they always were inside, the creatures they revealed themselves to be through their choices and actions. I simply gave them the opportunity to show their true nature to the world, to wear on the outside what they had always been on the inside." Marie-Claire looked back and saw horrors that would have driven her insane if she had still possessed a fully human mind capable of processing such visions. Judge Beauregard had become completely translucent, a ghost trying desperately to manipulate solid objects with fingers that passed through everything he touched, his judicial authority reduced to impotent gestures that affected nothing and convinced no one. Mrs. Fontaine was gasping for air through gills that couldn't extract enough oxygen from the atmosphere, drowning slowly in her own dining room while fully conscious of her fate and completely unable to prevent it. Dr. Mercier was writing frantically in a journal with hands that bled black ink, trying to record the infinite cascade of memories that were driving him toward madness, while simultaneously preserving his medical observations of his own transformation for a posterity that would never be able to read or understand his notes. His scientific training compelled him to document even his own destruction, creating a record of horrors that no human language could adequately describe. The others had fared no better. Each transformation was precisely calibrated to the specific sins of its subject. Each curse, a perfect reflection of the damage they had inflicted on others during their lives of privilege and cruelty built on systematic oppression. They would live forever now, or at least until the sun burned out and the earth grew cold, trapped in forms that would remind them every moment of what they had done, and who they had truly been all along. "This is justice," Delilah said, her voice carrying the authority of generations who had died without seeing their oppressors punished, the weight of ancestors who had passed on their knowledge and their hunger for retribution through bloodlines that had never forgotten or forgiven. "This is what happens when the bill finally comes due, when the debt is called in. When the cook decides that she's tired of serving meals to people who think she's less than human." She stepped aside then, allowing Marie-Claire to stumble past her toward the front door. But freedom was an illusion, escape impossible in a house that had become something more than a physical structure. The building had been transformed by the ritual performed within its walls, its architecture rearranged by forces that didn't recognize property deeds or legal ownership, that operated according to spiritual laws that were older than human civilization and more binding than any contract written in ink and signed before witnesses. The door that should have led to Royal Street instead opened onto an endless corridor lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a different stage of Marie-Claire's ongoing transformation. She ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing with sounds that had never been produced by human feet, and found herself back in the dining room where her husband and son and their guests continued their eternal meal, trapped in a cycle of consumption that would never end and never satisfy. The bread pudding was waiting for her at her place setting, steam rising from its surface in spirals that formed shapes in the air, hieroglyphs in languages that had been old when the pyramids were young, symbols that conveyed meaning to parts of the mind that had no connection to conscious thought or rational analysis. The smell was intoxicating, promising sweetness and comfort, and an end to the fear that had been consuming her since the moment she realized what was happening to her body and her world. All she had to do was take one bite, and the uncertainty would end. The transformation would be complete. She would know exactly what she was, would never again have to wonder about her true nature or her ultimate fate. The bread pudding would preserve her in her new form, would ensure that she could never change back or escape the consequences of the life she had chosen to live and the system she had chosen to support. She picked up the spoon with fingers that were no longer entirely her own, fingers that belonged to something that had never been entirely human, and took the first bite of her own damnation. The taste was indescribable, containing every moment of sweetness she had ever experienced, every pleasure she had taken at the expense of others, every luxury she had enjoyed while others suffered to provide it. But underneath the sweetness was something else, something that grew stronger with each swallow, something that had been waiting patiently for this moment for 23 years. The taste of ashes, the taste of blood, the taste of tears shed by people whose names she had never bothered to learn, whose pain she had never troubled to consider, whose humanity she had never troubled to acknowledge. Every bite brought new flavors, new memories that weren't her own, new understanding of the price that had been paid for her comfortable life and privileged position. As she ate, the dining room around her began to shift and change, revealing layers of reality that had always existed but had been hidden from normal human perception. The walls became transparent, showing the true structure of the house that lay beneath its civilized veneer. She could see the foundation stones, quarried by slave labor and mortared with the bones of those who died in the building's construction. She could see the wooden beams, cut from trees that had grown in soil fertilized with human suffering and watered with human tears. She could see the very nails that held it all together, forged in fires that had consumed the hopes and dreams of generations, shaped by hammers wielded by hands that had never been free to choose their own work or keep the profits from their labor. Every element of the house told a story of exploitation and cruelty, of wealth built on foundations that could never be solid because they rested on lies and violence that corrupted everything they touched. This was what Delilah had always seen when she looked at the Thibodeau mansion. Not a symbol of success and prosperity, but a monument to systematic cruelty, a temple dedicated to the worship of human misery. Every brick in its walls represented a life cut short by the system it housed. Every board in its floors was a dream destroyed by the institution it supported. Every pane of glass in its windows was a family torn apart and sold to different masters for the convenience and profit of people who never questioned their right to treat human beings as commodities. And now the house would serve a different purpose entirely. It would become a prison for those who had built their fortunes on such foundations, a containment system that would hold them accountable for their crimes in ways that human justice had never been able to achieve. They would live here forever, trapped in forms that reflected their true nature, sustained by the very cruelty they had inflicted on others, forced to experience the helplessness and dehumanization they had imposed on their victims. Their suffering would be eternal, but it would also be just. They would finally understand what it felt like to be powerless, to be treated as less than human, to exist at the mercy of forces that cared nothing for their comfort or dignity or survival. They would learn the lesson that their victims had been trying to teach them for generations, that cruelty creates its own consequences, that evil generates its own punishment, that justice may be delayed but can never be permanently denied. The bread pudding was finished. Marie Claire set down her spoon and felt the last of her human awareness slip away like morning mist before the rising sun. What remained was something else entirely, something that had been waiting inside her all along for the opportunity to emerge and reveal itself. She looked around the table at her fellow diners and saw them clearly for the first time, saw what they had always been beneath their cultured exteriors and refined manners and civilized pretensions. They were monsters. They had always been monsters. The only difference was that now their outer forms matched their inner reality, their physical appearance finally reflecting the spiritual truth that had defined them throughout their lives. They had created hell on earth for millions of human beings, and now they would live in a hell of their own making, experiencing eternally the consequences of choices they had made freely and defended passionately. Delilah surveyed her handiwork with the satisfaction of a master craftsman who has completed her greatest work, an artist whose vision has finally been realized after decades of patient planning and careful execution. The transformation was perfect, the justice precise, the punishment fitted to the crime with mathematical exactitude that balanced the cosmic equations that human law had never been able to address. These people had spent their lives consuming the labor and suffering of others, and now they would spend eternity consuming themselves, trapped in forms that would prevent them from ever again causing harm to the innocent. But justice is never a simple equation, and power always demands a price from those who wield it. Delilah had drawn on forces that were older than human civilization, had channeled energies that were never meant to flow through mortal vessels for extended periods. The ritual that had transformed her guests had also transformed her, changing her from a woman seeking revenge into something far more complex and dangerous, something that existed outside normal human categories and limitations. She could feel the knowledge flowing into her mind, the understanding of what she had become and what that meant for the world beyond the walls of this cursed house. She was no longer simply Delilah Rousseau, the cook who had served the Thibodeau family for 23 years. She had become something else, something that existed at the intersection of justice and vengeance, of human will and cosmic force, of time and eternity. The power that had enabled her to transform her oppressors would not simply disappear now that her immediate purpose had been fulfilled. It would continue to grow and evolve, seeking new applications and new targets, drawn to injustice wherever it existed, and empowered to correct imbalances that human institutions had failed to address. She had become an agent of cosmic justice, a force of nature disguised as a human being, a weapon forged from suffering and tempered by patience that had finally been unleashed upon a world that desperately needed such intervention. The house on Royal Street would stand forever now, or at least as long as the crimes it commemorated went unpunished in the wider world. It would serve as both prison and monument, containing the transformed guests while broadcasting a warning to anyone with the sensitivity to perceive its true nature. Those who built their fortunes on human suffering would find themselves drawn to visit, would feel an inexplicable compulsion to accept invitations to dinner parties that were never actually sent through normal channels, but arrived nonetheless through means that bypassed ordinary postal systems. And when they arrived, they would find Delilah waiting for them, still wearing her pristine white apron, still ready to serve a meal that would give them exactly what they deserved according to laws that recognized no statute of limitations and accepted no excuses based on social custom or economic necessity. The menu would be different for each group of guests, tailored to their specific crimes and particular weaknesses, but the outcome would always be the same. Perfect justice served with perfect precision to those who had escaped human accountability for far too long. The servants who had worked in the house fled before dawn, carrying stories that would be whispered in quarters throughout New Orleans for generations to come. They spoke of hearing laughter from the dining room that continued until sunrise, laughter that didn't sound entirely human but conveyed emotions that were recognizably triumphant and satisfied. They described the smell of cooking that continued to emanate from the kitchen, even though no one remained to tend the fires, aromas that suggested meals being prepared for guests who would never be satisfied no matter how much they consumed. They reported seeing lights in the windows long after the last candle should have burned out, lights that flickered in patterns that seemed almost like a code, a message being transmitted to recipients who possessed the knowledge necessary to interpret such signals. Some claimed to have glimpsed figures moving through the rooms, shadows that maintained human shapes but moved with the fluid grace of creatures that had never been bound by normal physical limitations. The official records were altered within days, with a speed and efficiency that suggested coordination at the highest levels of local government. The Thibodeau family was listed as having died of yellow fever, their bodies burned immediately to prevent the spread of contagion. The house was declared uninhabitable due to structural damage from the epidemic, its windows boarded up, and its doors sealed with official warnings about contamination that would keep curious observers at a safe distance. The servants who had fled were questioned briefly by authorities who seemed remarkably uninterested in their stories about strange transformations and supernatural justice. Their testimony was recorded in files that were immediately classified and stored in archives where they would never be accessible to historians or journalists. Those who insisted on sharing their experiences with friends and family members found that their listeners developed sudden amnesia about such conversations, remembering visits but forgetting entirely what had been discussed. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at suppression, adapting to new forms and finding new channels of transmission when traditional methods are blocked or corrupted. The other plantation owners in the region began to notice changes in their own kitchens, began to pay closer attention to the women who prepared their meals and the ingredients that went into their food. Certain dishes disappeared from menus throughout New Orleans, recipes that had been popular for generations suddenly becoming too dangerous to serve or too difficult to prepare properly. The slave trade in the city grew more cautious, dealers becoming reluctant to sell cooks who had worked too long in any one household, who had learned too much about their masters' weaknesses and appetites, who showed signs of possessing knowledge that went beyond normal culinary training. Prices for such slaves dropped dramatically as buyers began to understand that some bargains were too dangerous to pursue, that some advantages came with costs that far exceeded their apparent benefits. You might think this story ended with that dinner party in November 1852. You might believe that justice was served, that the guilty were punished, that the balance was restored and the cosmic ledgers were finally balanced. But you would be wrong to think it ended there, wrong to assume that power like Delilah's simply disappears when its initial purpose is fulfilled. Because such forces don't dissipate, they grow, they spread. They find new applications and new targets, drawn to injustice like iron filings to a magnet. The house on Royal Street still stands today, though the address has been changed 3 times, and the official records listed as a historical preservation project that has been under renovation for over 70 years. The permits are always current, the contractors always scheduled to begin work next month, the restoration plans always requiring just one more revision before implementation can commence. Tourists walk past it daily, most without giving it a second glance, their attention drawn to more conventional attractions that offer predictable experiences and comfortable narratives. But some pause inexplicably at its front gate, feeling a sudden chill despite the Louisiana heat, sensing something that their rational minds can't identify but their deeper instincts recognize as significant. They report smelling cooking aromas that seem to come from nowhere, hearing the faint sound of dinner conversation drifting from windows that have been boarded up since the Eisenhower administration, glimpsing movement behind boards that should contain nothing but empty rooms and accumulated dust. Local historians have documented a curious pattern surrounding the property that has persisted for over a century and a half. Every family that has attempted to purchase and renovate the house has changed their minds abruptly, usually within days of signing preliminary agreements. They cite various reasons for their decisions: unexpected financial difficulties, family emergencies that require their attention, sudden discoveries of structural problems that make renovation impractical. But those who investigate more deeply find a common thread. Each family has attended a dinner party shortly before withdrawing their offer, a meal that none of their friends remember organizing or attending. The contractors hired to work on the building consistently report equipment that moves on its own, materials that rearrange themselves overnight according to principles that violate the basic laws of physics and engineering. Tools disappear from locked storage containers and reappear in configurations that suggest intelligence and purpose behind their relocation. The persistent smell of jambalaya grows stronger the closer workers get to the original kitchen, accompanied by sensations of being watched by unseen observers who seem to be evaluating their intentions and finding them wanting. The New Orleans Tourism Bureau doesn't include the house in any official ghost tours, but guides who work the French Quarter have learned to avoid walking their groups past it after dark. They've discovered that tourists who linger too long at the gate sometimes receive invitations slipped under their hotel room doors that night, elegantly written cards that invite them to experience, quote, Authentic Creole cuisine prepared according to traditional methods passed down through generations of master cooks who understand the true purpose of food. Those who accept these invitations are never seen again, but their absence is rarely investigated with any thoroughness or persistence. Their hotel rooms are cleaned and rented to new guests within hours of checkout time. Their rental cars are returned to the agencies with no questions asked about the missing renters, the paperwork processed as routine transactions that require no special attention or follow-up. Their airline reservations are simply marked as no-shows, their luggage forwarded to addresses that exist on maps but correspond to empty lots or abandoned buildings. It's as if they never visited New Orleans at all, as if they never existed in the first place. Their families receive postcards explaining delays in their return, letters describing extended stays and wonderful experiences that justify their continued absence. The handwriting matches their loved ones perfectly. The details ring true to their personalities and interests. But the people who wrote these communications have already begun their eternal dinner service in a dining room, where time operates according to different rules, and justice follows different principles than those that govern the ordinary world. The pattern has continued for over a century and a half, adapting to changing times and new forms of injustice, with the flexibility that characterizes truly sophisticated systems of cosmic correction. Delilah's justice is no longer limited to antebellum plantation owners and their immediate associates. Modern guests at her eternal dinner party include real estate developers who profit from gentrification while displacing communities that have existed for generations, politicians who vote to defund social services while increasing subsidies for corporations that exploit their workers, corporate executives who build their wealth on the backs of employees who can't afford basic necessities despite working multiple jobs. The menu has evolved as well, incorporating new ingredients and techniques while maintaining the same fundamental purpose, giving people exactly what they deserve according to laws that recognize no statute of limitations and accept no excuses based on ignorance or social custom. Contemporary dishes might feature seafood contaminated with the industrial waste that these modern guests have dumped into waterways to increase their profit margins. Vegetables grown in soil poisoned by chemicals that they have lobbied to keep legal despite knowing their effects on human health. Restaurant owners throughout New Orleans have learned to recognize the signs that one of their cooks might be more than she appears. Dishes that taste impossibly perfect, ingredients that seem to enhance themselves during cooking, staff members who work with a precision and purpose that suggests knowledge beyond their apparent training. Smart restaurateurs don't ask questions about such things. They pay fair wages, treat their employees with respect and dignity, and try very hard not to think about what might happen if they don't. But not everyone has learned these lessons. Every year, new visitors to New Orleans arrive with old attitudes and older money, convinced that the right amount of cash can buy them anything they want, including people's labor, dignity, and silence about working conditions that would have appalled their ancestors. Every year, a few of them receive those elegant invitations, written in handwriting that seems to change styles depending on who's reading it, but always conveys the same essential message, an opportunity to experience the finest cuisine the city has to offer, prepared by hands that understand the true relationship between cook and diner, server and served. Every year, some of them are curious enough, arrogant enough, or hungry enough to accept. And every year, the house on Royal Street welcomes new permanent residents to its dining room, where dinner is served promptly at 7 o'clock every evening, where the conversation is always stimulating and the revelations always illuminating, where the meal never ends and the lessons learned can never be forgotten or ignored. The recipe for justice, it turns out, can be adapted for any era, any cuisine, any form of cruelty that humans devise in their endless creativity for finding new ways to exploit and dehumanize their fellow beings. All it requires is a cook who understands the true purpose of food, who knows that meals can nourish more than just the body, who remembers that every ingredient carries the memory of those who grew it, harvested it, transported it, and prepared it under conditions that reveal the moral character of those who benefit from such labor. Someone who understands that cooking is the ultimate expression of power over life and death, over satisfaction and hunger, over comfort and suffering. Someone who recognizes that the kitchen is a place where transformation occurs not just through the application of heat and seasoning, but through the channeling of intentions and energies that operate according to laws older than human civilization and more binding than any contract written by lawyers or enforced by governments. Someone like Delilah Rousseau, who is still cooking in that kitchen, still preparing meals that give people exactly what they deserve according to principles that recognize no social distinctions and accept no appeals based on wealth or status or family connections. Still waiting patiently for the next dinner guest who thinks they can treat human beings like property, who believes their money makes them better than those who serve them, who mistakes temporary advantage for permanent immunity from the consequences of their choices and actions. She has all the time in the world to wait, having learned the most important ingredient in any recipe for justice: patience seasoned with perfect understanding of how power really works and why it must eventually be balanced by accountability. And she's discovered that the most satisfying meals are always worth the preparation they require, no matter how long that preparation might take or how complex the process might become. The next time you visit New Orleans, pay attention to the smells drifting from restaurant kitchens late at night when the tourists have gone home and the city shows its true face to those who know how to look. Notice which dishes seem to taste better than they should, which meals leave you feeling more satisfied than mere food should be able to provide, which restaurants employ cooks whose eyes hold depths that suggest knowledge beyond their apparent years or training. And if you happen to receive an elegant invitation to a private dinner party at an address on Royal Street, remember that some invitations are best declined, some meals are too expensive regardless of whether money changes hands, and some cooks understand ingredients and techniques that were never taught in any culinary school or described in any cookbook available to the general public. Because the cook is still working, the kitchen is still open. The table is still set for guests who understand that justice delayed is not justice denied, merely justice that has been allowed to ferment into something more potent and more perfectly tailored to the specific crimes it addresses. And she's always ready to serve a meal that will give you exactly what you deserve, prepared with skill that transcends ordinary understanding, and served with the knowledge that some debts can only be paid through transformation that reveals the truth about who we really are beneath the masks we wear for society's benefit. The house waits, the cook prepares. And somewhere in New Orleans tonight, someone who has built their fortune on other people's suffering is about to receive an invitation they won't be able to refuse.